Shattered grief. The last rays of the Texas sun filtered through the living room windows as Emma Sanders sat motionless on the floral-patterned couch, her eyes fixed on the photograph clutched in her trembling hands. The house, once filled with laughter, now echoed with silence, a hollow emptiness that pressed in from every corner. The image in her grasp showed a smiling trio. Emma, at 16, sandwiched between her mother and father, all wind-blown hair and easy grins after a weekend at the lake. That memory felt as distant as a half-remembered dream. 10 days had passed since the accident, but for Emma, time seemed to have lost meaning. The shock of it, her mother's sudden death, a foggy phone call, the sterile whiteness of a hospital corridor, still played on a relentless loop in her mind. She remembered gripping her father's hand, both of them numb as the doctors murmured apologies she barely comprehended. Since then, her father, David, had thrown himself into work. His way of coping. He filled his nights with paperwork and emails, seeking distraction from a grief too large to contain. At school, Emma drifted through the hallways, her friends unsure of what to say. Whispered condolences followed her from class to class, and she quickly grew to dread the pitying looks from teachers and classmates alike. They meant well, but their sympathy only twisted the knife, reminding her again and again that her world would never be the same. Home was no refuge. The house felt too big, echoing with the absence of her mother's voice, the aroma of her cooking, the soft hum of her singing on weekend mornings. Each room held reminders: the floral apron flung over a kitchen chair, her mother's gardening gloves by the back door, a note stuck to the fridge written in looping cursive. "Pick up milk, please. Love you." Now those reminders felt like cruel reminders rather than comforts. David tried, in his awkward, fumbling way, to support his daughter. He would knock gently on her bedroom door at night, offering to order takeout or watch a movie. But his efforts always fizzled into silence. They sat, side by side, in their grief, but unable to bridge the gap between them. Emma felt like she was losing her father too, as if he were slowly fading away under the weight of his own sorrow. The loneliness was suffocating. Some evenings, Emma would crawl beneath her mother's quilt, inhaling the faint, fading scent of her perfume, desperate for just a moment of comfort. She wrote in her journal long into the night, her entries tumbling into angry, messy scribbles. Why did she have to go? Why is Dad so far away? How am I supposed to keep going without her? Fears crept into Emma's mind. Fears of the future, of changes she couldn't name. She began to sense, even in this early stage, that nothing would ever return to normal, though she desperately wished it could. For now, all she could do was survive the days as they came, piecing herself together from the fragments left behind. Little did Emma know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would test her strength in ways she could never imagine. The stepmother storm spring in Texas brought the scent of wildflowers drifting along with the warmth. But for Emma Sanders, the world remained chilled and colorless. It had only been a few months since her mother's funeral, when David Sanders, Emma's father, quietly announced he had started seeing someone. Linda Harper entered Emma's life like a brisk wind. Polished, composed, never a hair out of place. At first, Linda seemed determined to do everything right. Polite smiles, freshly baked cookies, soft-voiced questions about Emma's classes and hobbies. Even so, Emma felt nothing resembling comfort, only the uneasy prickling of being watched. It wasn't long before Linda moved in. The house became an unfamiliar place, the living room rearranged according to Linda's taste, her collection of porcelain figurines displayed prominently on the mantel. the kitchen filled with new ingredients and a strict sense of order. Emma watched her mother's apron disappear from the back of the kitchen chair, replaced by one with neat, monogrammed initials, LH. Each change, though small, carved out her mother's memory a bit more, leaving Emma feeling displaced in her own home. Linda's public persona was flawless. To David and the extended family, she was attentive and charming, helping host dinners and tending to Emma's needs with what seemed like earnest concern. Emma's aunts, uncles, and even her grandmother remarked on how lucky David was to have found such a supportive woman during a time of loss. Teachers at school, hearing about Emma's wonderful new stepmother, patted her shoulder and echoed the same optimism. But behind closed doors, the mood shifted. Private interactions with Linda were cold, clipped, and increasingly controlling. There were comments about Emma's posture at dinner, the way she folded laundry, the music playing in her room. Rules multiplied. Curfews moved earlier, snacks were forbidden in the living room, phone calls to friends became a privilege rather than a given. If Emma forgot to turn off a light or left her backpack in the hall, Linda sighed heavily and made a mental note to David. Each evening, Emma overheard murmurs about responsibility and discipline, as David nodded tiredly, too drained from work to question Linda's new regime. Emma tried to talk with her dad about the subtle shifts in their home, the tension that crackled whenever Linda was near, the constant feeling that she was being evaluated and found lacking. But whenever she tried, David brushed aside her concerns, gently urging her to give Linda a chance or suggesting that things would get easier in time. "We're all adjusting," he repeated, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. School, once a refuge from grief, now felt like enemy territory. Some classmates, eager for gossip, asked Emma about her cool stepmom. Others offered half-joking reminders about Cinderella and wicked stepmothers, but Emma didn't find it funny. She withdrew further, her circle of friends shrinking, phones silent by choice. At home, Emma's sense of isolation grew deeper. Linda made a habit of excluding Emma from casual family decisions. What to make for dinner, what movie to watch on the weekends, even where to hang new artwork. Whenever Emma tried to assert an opinion, Linda would cut her off with a gentle correction or a patronizing smile, so practiced that nobody but Emma seemed to notice its coldness. Worst of all, Linda began to point out Emma's mistakes to David, always in concerned tones. "I worry about Emma's lack of effort with her chores. I'm not sure she's coping well with her responsibilities." Bit by bit, Emma's confidence wavered. Each night she wrote in her journal under the covers, filling page after page with frustration, anger, and the inescapable feeling of being invisible. She wondered what her mother would have thought of Linda. Would she have seen through the perfect facade the way Emma did? Would her father have listened if her mother warned him? Just as Emma feared her voice was entirely lost, she caught glimpses of Linda's true nature. A calculated narrowing of her eyes when outsiders turned their backs, a sharpness in her words that didn't exist in public conversation. Emma began to suspect that the walls closing in around her held more secrets than she realized. As shadows deepened in the house, Emma resolved not to give in to despair. Somewhere inside, a spark of rebellion and self-preservation flared. If this was the new reality, then she would find a way to survive it, even if it meant standing alone. False accusations and despair. As the weeks slipped by under Linda's rule, Emma's life became a minefield of accusations and misunderstandings. It began with small incidents: a set of car keys gone missing, a spill on the kitchen floor that no one admitted to, a vase knocked over and shattered on the hallway table. Each time something went wrong, Linda's eyes would land on Emma with cool certainty. "Emma, we've talked about being careful. You need to take responsibility," she would say, her voice soft but edged with accusation. At first, Emma tried to defend herself. She explained over and over that she hadn't lost the keys. She hadn't been near the vase. The kitchen floor was already sticky when she walked in. But her protests seemed only to harden Linda's belief, and gradually her father's. David, worn down by stress and Linda's persistent gentle reminders, began to cast wary glances at Emma. He asked pointed but tired questions. "Are you sure you didn't take it, honey?" And seemed disappointed every time Emma shook her head. Linda's accusations grew bolder. She suggested that Emma was failing to show respect, that she was acting out in her grief. Food began to vanish from the pantry, and Linda would quietly tell David, "I found wrappers hidden under Emma's bed." A private conversation between Emma and a friend was overheard and twisted. "I'm worried she's talking behind our backs," Linda confided with apparent concern. The rules grew even stricter. Emma's phone was checked for evidence of bad influence. Her internet access was limited for her own good. Emma's isolation became complete. When she tried to turn to her teachers or her best friend, Megan, she encountered polite skepticism. Ms. Rourke, her homeroom teacher, squeezed Emma's hand and said gently, "You've been through a lot. Maybe your stepmom really does have your best interests at heart." Megan replied with a hesitant shrug. "I mean, I've seen Linda around. She seems nice enough. Are you sure you're not just, extra sensitive right now?" The gulf between Emma and everyone else widened until it felt insurmountable. At home, her father's love became distant and conditional. He didn't shout or threaten, but his disappointment was palpable. He spent more time at work, leaving Emma and Linda alone together for long evenings that resembled elaborate dances. Linda choreographing every interaction, Emma desperately trying not to step out of line. When David returned late at night, Linda would give him updates, subtle but barbed. "Emma didn't follow the house rules again today. I really hope she can adjust soon." Emma heard these words drift through the thin walls and felt her heart harden with resentment and helplessness. The pressure weighed on Emma constantly. She second-guessed every move, flinched at every unexpected sound, triple-checked every locked door and homework assignment. Her journal became her only outlet, its pages filled with frantic attempts to preserve her sanity. "How do I prove I'm not lying? Why won't anyone believe me? I miss Mom so much. I don't want to disappear." But the worst part was the growing doubt in her own mind. Linda's steady campaign eroded Emma's confidence in herself. Sometimes, Emma wondered if maybe she tried to imagine escape, but no door seemed open. Family members dismissed her fears. The school counselor, new that semester, promised to speak to Linda about better communication at home, only to return later and report, "Your stepmother loves you very much. She wants what's best for your family." It was as though Linda had constructed a glass labyrinth around Emma. One-way mirrors on every side, the world able to see nights became the worst. Emma lay awake listening to the Texas wind rattle the window panes. Her stomach knotted with anxiety. Every sound from the hallway set her heart racing. Sometimes she hid her tears in her pillow, desperate to keep even that small vulnerability from Linda. More and more, Emma's thoughts circled around a single question. Would it always be like this? Or somehow, could she find the strength to fight back, even as she felt weaker every day? A glimmer of hope. For weeks, Emma's world felt carved in stone, her innocence under constant siege, her spirit battered by the relentless onslaught of blame and disbelief. Routine became her shield and her cage. On the surface, she performed her duties with mechanical precision, tiptoeing around Linda's rules and expectations. Behind the mask, her heart beat with dread, each day blending uneasily into the next. The one safe place left was the worn journal under her mattress, its pages thick with grief, confusion, and the faintest flicker of resistance. The Texas spring deepened. Apricot-colored sunlight filtered into Emma's room, casting long afternoon shadows through the curtains. One Saturday, the house was quieter than usual. Linda had left for a charity luncheon, and her father was out on errands. For once, Emma was alone. She breathed easier, wandering through the sunlit halls, reacquainting herself with the peace that had once lived here. As she passed her stepmother's office, a room Linda rarely left unlocked, Emma noticed the door resting slightly ajar. Her heart raced. Linda had always made a point of displaying false transparency, but in reality, she guarded her privacy fiercely. Unable to resist, Emma gently nudged the door and peeked inside. The room was flooded with fragrant light, and piles of papers covered the desk in neat, obsessive stacks. Emma hesitated on the threshold. Curiosity warred with guilt and fear. After all, hadn't Linda spent months painting her as untrustworthy? Still, the urge to know more, to reclaim some sliver of power, won out. She stepped into the room. Drawers partially open revealed bank statements and invoices. Emma's eyes flickered over letterheads she didn't recognize, and receipts for purchases unfamiliar to her. Designer handbags, fine wines, and jewelry, none of which had ever appeared in the house. A checkbook, its pages stubs marked with her father's signature, lay on the corner of the desk. But it was the phone, buzzing mutely in a leather purse, that caught her attention. A new notification pulsed on the lock screen. A message preview. "Are you sure no one suspects anything?" The sender's name was hidden by a string of coded numbers. A second message followed. "You have to be careful. He can't find out about us." Emma's stomach twisted. With shaking hands, Emma lifted the purse and peered inside. There, tucked deep within an inner zipper, was a small, spiral-bound notebook. She hesitated, then slipped it free. Most entries were written in Linda's rigid, slanted handwriting, a self-absorbed record of daily grievances and plans. One entry stood out, a rant about the brat. It could only mean her. A list of chores, and cryptically, "Don't forget to delete the texts. David must never read them." Beneath, it was a reminder about a lawyer's appointment, one that Emma's father had never mentioned. The breath caught in her lungs. Evidence. Real evidence, finally, that Linda was hiding something. Her blood pounded with adrenaline as she carefully photographed the notebook pages with her phone, hands trembling before sliding the book neatly back in place. Before she left, Emma noticed an envelope wedged between the drawers. Inside were copies of threatening messages, some sent to Emma's father, some to people whose names Emma didn't know. The tone was cold and demanding, unlike anything Linda projected in her daily syrupy voice. She barely had time to collect herself before the sound of a car outside snapped her into motion. Heart hammering, she gathered her courage and slipped quietly out of the office, leaving everything looking perfectly undisturbed. Upstairs, she locked her door and backed away from it, mind racing. That afternoon marked a turning point. Gone was the numbness that had filled her for months. In its place blazed a righteous anger and a stubborn sense of hope. She realized something inescapable. She wasn't powerless. If Linda could orchestrate lies so convincingly, then maybe, just maybe, Emma could find a way to expose the truth. That night, Emma started a new section in her journal, one devoted not to her emotions but to evidence. She wrote down times, dates, and the content of every argument and accusation. She packed away her fear, replacing it with careful observation. There was a new thrill in her step as she realized she could fight back, if she was clever and patient enough. Soon, Emma bought a small audio recorder with the money she'd saved for concert tickets the year before. The next day, She tucked it discreetly into her hoodie pocket whenever Linda cornered her in the kitchen or berated her about invented mistakes. She learned to hit record with a casual thumbs-up gesture and to silence it just as quickly. Within days, she captured half a dozen clips, Linda snapping orders, muttering about getting David on board, and even, one night, unleashing a venomous threat. "One word and you'll be sent to some boarding school. You wouldn't want that, would you?" Her hands trembled with a mix of fear and vindication each time she played the recordings back through headphones. Determined, Emma dug deeper into Linda's past. She emailed one of her late mother's closest friends, Mrs. O'Malley, a retired paralegal, and carefully asked about legal help, phrasing it as a hypothetical for a friend. Encouraged by the discreet replies, Emma began to research. What made evidence admissible in court? How did one prove psychological manipulation or gaslighting? With each step, her hope grew, and so did her resolve. She had to be methodical. She password-protected the files on her phone and locked her journal in a shoebox, hidden beneath her window seat, in the small hours of the night. Emma scrolled through old news articles and pieced together rumors about Linda's previous marriages. One local headline, nearly a decade old, caught her eye. Mystery surrounds sudden divorce of local couple. The bride in the grainy photo was Linda, wearing a practiced smile. A few more clicks unearthed a half-forgotten blog post by a woman named Stacy, who hinted at a manipulative woman who destroyed our family from the inside out. The details were fragmentary, but Emma saw enough to believe Linda had a pattern. For the first time in months, Emma dared to reach out to Megan, her old best friend. The stilted, lonely texts of the past gave way to late-night phone calls. Together, they brainstormed ways to document evidence. Megan gave her the number of her cousin, who'd taken a law class. With every tip and supportive word, Emma felt her burdens lighten, bolstered by the knowledge that she was not as alone as she had believed. At home, Emma continued her charade of compliance. She volunteered for extra chores and answered to Linda's barbed comments calmly, keeping her eyes and ears open. Little by little, Linda seemed to relax, confident that her plan was working, that Emma was broken and compliant, but Emma's heart beat only with determination. Each small victory, another recording captured, another odd expense photographed, another misleading email saved, rekindled a sense of purpose inside her. Emma watched her stepmother, now not as a victim, but as a quiet investigator, tracking every move, mapping every manipulation. The isolation slowly receded, replaced by a web of strategies and allies. Though the finish line was distant and the cost of discovery high, Emma knew one thing with certainty: hope, no matter how fragile, had returned. With it came the belief that justice might still be possible, and that she herself, wounded, doubted, but persistent, could be the one to bring it to light. Silent investigation. The first seeds of Emma's quiet rebellion were sown in secrecy. Linda's behavior continued unchanged, threatening beneath her smiles, keen-eyed when Emma faltered, dismissive when she did not. To the outside world, Linda and David presented a picture of normalcy, but Emma had learned to see the cracks hidden beneath the glossy surface. Every smile from Linda seemed to shiver with malice behind closed doors. It was this chilling dichotomy that convinced Emma she needed more than a handful of suspicious receipts and voice recordings. If she wanted to be believed, her evidence would have to be overwhelming and indisputable. She started small, collecting ordinary things with extraordinary care. Copies of weekly schedules that differed from Linda's accounts, screenshots of text messages Linda sent to her father when away from home, and records of missing or altered supplies around the house. Emma knew that one snippet here or there might be dismissed as coincidence, but a pattern, constructed, steadily, day by day. could not so easily be brushed aside. Each evening, after finishing her assignments and completing Linda's ever-changing list of chores, Emma would retreat to her room, headphones over her ears, journal open in her lap. She inventoried her memories, supplementing each with newly gathered data. There were columns for dates, notes about Linda's attitudes, and cross-references to any supporting evidence. What began as raw suspicion slowly took shape as a narrative of manipulation and emotional abuse. Weeks into her investigation, Emma realized she needed outside help to understand how adults made their lies so convincing, or how the legal system might interpret her findings. She began frequenting the school library, poring over books about psychology, law, and family dynamics, always wary of prying eyes. She read about gaslighting, about covert narcissism, and parental alienation syndrome. The language of manipulation became less foreign, and she started to put words to the bewildering experiences that had left her so often lost and voiceless. Online, Emma found communities of survivors anonymously sharing stories eerily like her own. She read lurking, never posting, a silent observer, comforted by the assurance that she wasn't crazy, nor was she the only one. With careful resolve, she reached out to Mrs. O'Malley, her former neighbor and her mother's close friend, who had retired from a paralegal job years earlier. Posing her questions as hypothetical scenarios, Emma asked about the legal weight of audio recordings, digital evidence, and diaries. In time, Mrs. O'Malley, suspecting the truth, offered gentle advice, always with caution. Write down everything you see, Emma. Details matter in court. What seems small to you might be the key to their understanding. Determined to know more about Linda's past, Emma turned to the internet's dense maze. She remembered her flashes of insight from Linda's hidden documents, cryptic hints about lawyers, references to people she didn't know. Late at night, she combed through old digital white pages, social media, and archived local news stories, searching for any trace of Linda's previous life. One foggy evening, she hit on something, a faded newspaper article from over a decade ago, describing a sudden divorce involving a Linda M. Harper, then a young wife in Houston. There were whispers in the piece of unsettled differences and domestic disputes, but no specifics, just enough to raise more questions. From the article, she followed up on the names mentioned in the comment section, people who had lived in the same neighborhood as Linda long ago. Using old social media posts and a little guesswork, she found one. Stacy Randall, who had written a cryptic blog post years before about a charming villain who nearly ruined our family. Heart-pounding, Emma drafted a careful email explaining that she was dealing with someone who sounded very similar. And would Stacy be willing, discreetly, to share her experience? Surprisingly, she received a compassionate and lengthy reply. Stacy remembered Linda vividly. Manipulative, cunning, and always out for herself. She'd twist everyone's words around and play the victim when challenged. Stacy recounted incidents of small thefts blamed on children, broken trust, and the emotional exhaustion of always being on guard. Having corroborated Linda's pattern, Emma decided to focus on Linda's activities in the present. She watched how Linda spoke with neighbors, how she handled the housekeeper, and how she tried to ingratiate herself with David's clients. Emma noticed that Linda always kept a private business phone on her at all times, a device different from the family's regular phones. Linda claimed it was for charity board matters, but Emma noted the frequency of calls late at night, the nervous tension whenever the device chimed. Patiently, Emma waited for chances to gather additional evidence. Sometimes, Linda would leave the phone charging in the kitchen as she tended to the dishwasher or went upstairs. When she had a few seconds alone, Emma snapped quick photos of the call logs and messages using her own phone, careful never to open anything or leave a trace. Most of the messages dealt with fundraising accounts and strange one-line transactions that did not add up. Emma's investigation soon extended beyond the house. On a whim, she reached out to her father's old colleagues and friends, seeking out anyone who had met Linda during her short courtship with David. Some remembered odd comments, or times Linda had contradicted herself. Little warning signs that seemed trivial then but that now made a different kind of sense. Emma compiled their stories, adding to her growing pile of corroborating statements. Grateful for a partner in her quest, Emma confided once more in Megan, her trusted friend. Megan, at first wary, soon became her co-conspirator. With Megan's cousin, a law student, advising from afar, they brainstormed the best ways to make evidence court-proof. Megan reminded Emma to keep thorough backups and suggested using cloud storage in case Linda ever confiscated her devices. Eventually, Emma created a digital safe box, a secure folder, password-protected, hidden behind layers of innocuous files on her laptop. She encrypted the most important recordings and documents so they couldn't easily be deleted. During moments of doubt, she would open one up and remind herself that the truth was on her side. If only she could make others see it. Emma's methods grew more strategic. She noticed that Linda thrived on chaos, often manufacturing crises to distract David from asking questions or noticing new purchases. Emma countered by logging each crisis, the sudden arguments, mysterious bills, or family disputes, and linking them to major changes in the household or attempts to isolate her further. Little by little, the pattern unfolded, a tapestry of deception designed to exhaust and marginalize her. All the while, Emma maintained a mask of submission at home, completing chores, answering "yes, ma'am" to every chilly directive, and offering no sign of her quiet resistance. Her journal filled with coded references, a double underline here, a symbol there, in case Linda ever stumbled onto her private thoughts. Despite the fear, Emma felt herself growing stronger. Each new discovery, each careful step toward the truth, chipped away at her sense of helplessness. In time, what had started as a desperate scramble for survival became a methodical, powerful project. The road ahead was uncertain, and Emma knew that a single misstep could result in everything being lost. Or worse, more lies spread about her. Yet for the first time in over a year, she saw beyond the walls Linda had built. She could visualize a future where her voice might finally be heard and believed. And so she pressed on. Each move a secret act of courage against the shadows that clung so tightly to her home. The truth emerges. As the weeks pressed forward, the balance of power in the Sanders household began to tremble. Though Linda still wielded her authority with subtle cruelty, there was a new tension in the air, a wariness that signaled she sensed a shift beneath the surface. Emma, for her part, moved with increasing caution, now careful not only to protect her spirit, but also her mounting collection of evidence. Each note, recording, and photograph meticulously archived. Emma had become almost invisible within her own home, yet she saw everything. Her silent investigation had armed her with knowledge and a surprising well of courage. Every whispered phone call, every forced smile at the dinner table, every look of calculation from Linda was now logged in her mind's journal. She found herself listening not just for what was said, but for what was omitted, for the strategic silences that betrayed Linda's unease. One afternoon, the truth began to tease its way into the open. Linda, who usually left the kitchen spotless, was suddenly careless. She snapped at the housekeeper in a way she never had before, dropping her mask of courtesy for a split second. Emma caught the look the housekeeper shot her, a silent question, edged with concern. Later that day, when they found themselves alone, the housekeeper, Mrs. Martin, approached Emma behind the safety of closed pantry doors. "Is everything all right, sweetheart?" Mrs. Martin asked in a hushed voice. Emma hesitated, torn between fear and desperation, but the woman's genuine kindness was a balm against the daily coldness she endured. Emma nodded, but her voice sounded small. "Would you, if anything ever seemed wrong, would you tell someone?" Mrs. Martin's response was firm. "Of course I would, and I'd help you in any way I could." That brief exchange, seemingly inconsequential, became the crack through which daylight seeped. Realizing she might have an ally in Mrs. Martin, Emma resolved to gather her evidence more deliberately. She shared some of her suspicions, careful not to reveal too much, but explaining enough about the accusations, missing items, and strangely altered documents to earn Mrs. Martin's trust. Together, the two of them began to work quietly, searching for inconsistencies in the household records, cataloging times when Linda's version of events diverged from reality. Mrs. Martin noticed checks missing from the checkbook and personal items that suddenly appeared in Linda's closet, luxuries that couldn't be explained by Linda's modest charity work. Occasionally, Mrs. Martin heard snippets of conversations, Linda's voice sharp, warning someone over the phone about keeping their mouths shut, or threatening legal action if things didn't go her way. Meanwhile, Linda's paranoia blossomed. She began scrutinizing Emma's belongings, rearranging Emma's room to help her stay organized, and checking her backpack under the pretense of looking for lost family items. Emma, anticipating these invasions, hid her most important files in an encrypted online account and kept backup audio devices tucked among innocuous belongings like a hairbrush or a book spine. The pressure of the evolving situation began to strain David as well. He noticed the unease between his daughter and his wife, the way Emma avoided family dinners, and the tension that hummed through the air when all three shared a room. One evening, when he returned home late, he found Emma sitting alone in the darkened living room. Without words, she handed him a photograph, a picture of her and her late mother, untouched by Linda's intrusion. The silent exchange struck him with a pang of guilt. That night, David found himself paying attention, questioning Linda's explanations. When she tried to share another report of Emma's supposed disrespect, he listened but also watched Linda closely. Suddenly, stories that once seemed plausible now sounded thin. Why did Linda always find fault? Why did Emma's eyes always dull when he asked about her day? Emma sensed her father's wavering and knew she had to act, while momentum hovered in her favor. With Mrs. Martin's help, she orchestrated an accidental discovery. The housekeeper, while cleaning, found a stash of receipts for expensive jewelry and clothes in Linda's locked armoire. Purchases made using David's credit card, yet never seen in the house or gifted to anyone. David was shocked, bringing the matter up over dinner. Linda's response was uncharacteristically clumsy, a stuttering denial, followed by a flurry of blame directed at Emma and Mrs. Martin. The confrontation that followed marked the first real fissure in Linda's control. Emma watched as her father pressed for answers, demanding clarity on the discrepancies in the bank statements and the mysterious phone calls Linda claimed were charity-related. When David suggested bringing in an accountant to audit their finances, Linda erupted, seething with fury, and retreating to her room, slamming the door behind her. Emma's heart pounded with hope and dread. The walls were finally crumbling, but there was still risk. She spent hours compiling every bit of evidence she'd collected. The voice memos, where Linda called her a nuisance, the threatening messages intended for others, the statements from Mrs. Martin detailing omitted payments and mistreatment. She also documented her own side, the dates when false accusations were made, times when Linda's punishment was harsher than warranted, testimonies from classmates and teachers who noticed Emma's sudden withdrawal after Linda arrived. She reached out to Megan and Megan's cousin, the law student, for help sorting and presenting this mountain of information. Megan coached her on how to structure a timeline, emphasizing patterns of manipulation and financial misconduct, and suggested compiling a backup dossier to give to Mrs. Martin or the school counselor if anything ever happened. As days went by, Linda's behavior grew more unhinged. She picked fights over trivial matters, accused Emma and Mrs. Martin of conspiring against her, and even threatened to call the police over theft when her belongings were moved during cleaning. Her carefully crafted image began to unravel not only within the home, but in the community. Neighbors started to whisper about Linda's recent outbursts and the tension others noticed at church events and family gatherings. Finally, David approached Emma privately, voice shaking with a conflicted blend of regret and resolve. "Is there something you want to tell me? Anything about Linda or about this house? I promise I'll listen." The invitation was all Emma had needed, and with trembling hands she presented him with the documentation, digital and physical, she'd gathered over the months. She played him a recording where Linda's true, cruel tone was unmistakable. David listened, at first disbelieving, but Emma's evidence was thorough and irrefutable. He understood, finally, the sorrow behind his daughter's silence and the fractured trust that kept her emotionally isolated. He promised to take care, to move slowly and do things by the book, for both Emma's safety and the legality of what came next. That night, Emma felt the weight she'd carried for so long begin to ease. The truth, once buried and denied, now hovered just beneath the surface. Inevitable, undeniable, ready to break through. What began with suspicion and dread had become a cause for hope. The gears of justice, slow but inexorable, were now set in motion. Emma, for the first time in more than a year, allowed herself to believe in the possibility of deliverance and to trust that this time her voice would truly be heard. The courtroom climax. The day of the courtroom finally arrived, heavy with anticipation and uncertainty. Emma woke before dawn, the Texas sky barely lightening beyond her bedroom window. Outside, the world seemed unwilling to move forward, as if the rising sun itself was wary of shining light on what would happen next. Inside her chest, Emma's heart thudded, a blend of anxiety and something almost like hope. David had spent the previous weeks gathering legal counsel, compiling every receipt, message, and audio file Emma had risked so much to preserve. He had spoken, quietly but determinedly, with school counselors, neighbors, and family members. Even those who had previously doubted Emma now began to question what the polished surface of Linda's personality had been hiding all along. By the time they stepped into the courthouse, an austere building of brick and white columns, echoing with the murmurs of hundreds of families in turmoil, Emma felt as if she were walking into battle. The waiting room was cold, its hard benches lined with people from other families, all carrying their own burdens. Linda arrived in a designer suit, her hair perfectly styled, eyes outlined and unreadable. She sat apart from Emma and David, her attorney whispering in her ear, posture radiating a brittle confidence. To outsiders, she seemed composed, even aggrieved, but Emma recognized the tension in her jaw and the darting movements of her hands. For the first time, Linda looked uncertain. The courtroom itself was intimidating, high ceilings, creaking old pews, and a judge elevated behind the bench. Legal proceedings began slowly, with attorneys shuffling documents and confirming testimony. David's lawyer was diligent and steady, presenting their case with calm logic. Linda, in contrast, leaned into the role of victim, giving the judge tearful explanations about her efforts to support Emma, her confusion over the family's change in atmosphere, and accusations of having been targeted by misunderstood grief. But the tide of the hearing shifted as Emma took the stand. Her hands trembled at first, but she met the judge's gaze and answered every question clearly. Emma spoke of her isolation, her experiences, and most importantly, the specifics of Linda's manipulative behavior. She described the changing house rules, the false accusations, the way her friends grew distant as Linda's insinuations poisoned her reputation. Emma did not exaggerate. She simply told the truth, backed up by careful journals and corroborating testimony. The judge listened, asking Emma about details others might have missed. "Can you describe how these new rules made you feel? Did you ever discuss these issues with your father? And if so, what was his reaction? Why do you believe these accusations were aimed only at you?" Emma answered honestly, even when the questions made her voice tremble. She'd spent nights reliving her pain, but in the safe embrace of the court, her hurt transformed into resolve. David was called next. Seeing his daughter on the stand, he realized the full extent of how far they'd both come and how much he'd missed, blinded by grief and by Linda's careful manipulations. He described changes in Emma's demeanor, her withdrawal, and his gradual awareness that something was fundamentally wrong beneath the household's surface calm. David admitted his regret and affirmed the proof he now understood: financial discrepancies traced to Linda, unexplained purchases, and threatening messages. When Linda's attorney cross-examined, attempting to undermine Emma's credibility, the plan quickly unraveled. Emma's evidence was overwhelming. Audio recordings caught Linda's voice in moments of unguarded disdain. Journal entries aligned with text messages and receipts. Witness statements from Mrs. Martin and former neighbors confirmed inconsistencies in Linda's stories. The more Linda tried to defend herself, raising her voice, gesturing dramatically, the more her carefully built persona frayed. At one tense point, Linda attempted to shift blame entirely onto Emma, accusing her of theft, manipulation, and even suggesting that Emma had doctored evidence out of some twisted revenge. But the prosecution calmly countered with digital timestamps and expert affidavits from the law student Megan had connected Emma with, showing the record's authenticity. The courtroom fell silent during a pivotal moment. One of Emma's audio recordings played over the quiet speakers. Linda's voice pierced the stillness, unmistakably cruel. "One word, and you'll be sent to some boarding school. You wouldn't want that, would you?" There was no mistaking to whom she was speaking, nor the intent behind her threat. Linda's attorney tried to object, but the damage was done. Emma watched the judge, whose previously neutral face now showed clear concern and, most importantly, belief. As testimony wound to a close, the judge requested statements from both sides. Emma's was simple, written in careful script. "I just want to feel safe in my own home again. I want people to believe me, and I want my family to have a chance to heal." David echoed his daughter's plea, stating his desire to protect Emma and to see truth finally recognized over appearances. Linda, with her position thoroughly undermined, grew desperate. Her closing remarks were fragmented, alternating between blame, denial, and attempts to garner sympathy. But by then, even her own attorney seemed resigned to the inevitable outcome. The judge's ruling was direct, thoughtful, and decisive. He cited the extensive pattern of manipulation and the intentional harm caused to Emma, stating explicitly that Linda's behavior was emotionally and psychologically abusive. Linda was ordered to leave the home immediately pending further hearings on property and divorce settlements. Anson. Investigation was opened into her financial affairs, particularly the possibility of fraud or other illicit activity. As the bailiff escorted Linda from the courtroom, unease slipped into relief. Emma felt as if she had been holding her breath for months, and finally could exhale. For the first time, her father knelt beside her in the corridor and wrapped her in a long, wordless embrace. Others, Mrs. Martin, Megan, the school counselor, expressed quiet support, small gestures of triumph that felt enormous after so much isolation. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight was warm and daffodils nodded bright heads in the breeze. Emma's future was still uncertain, but she finally saw a path forward, one made clear and steady by her own determination and the simple, unassailable power of truth. Justice and liberation. The courtroom verdict rumbled through Emma's world for days, reshaping reality in its wake. Linda's departure was sudden. One day, her icy presence seemed to haunt every hallway, and the next, only a faint trace of perfume lingered in the house, like a memory fighting to cling. For so long, the Sanders home had felt like a fortress of accusation and distrust. But now the walls seemed to breathe again. Silence returned, but it was the gentle quiet of peace, not the suffocating hush of fear. For Emma, the change was almost too much to process at first. Freedom, after months of constriction and surveillance, seemed fragile, like a new bud emerging from a frost-bound ground. Her world was still haunted by the habits Linda had etched into her. Hesitation before speaking, nerves at any loud sound, the instinct to check and double-check every move. Yet each day sans Linda, the air in the house grew lighter, the laughter easier, the simple pleasures, like sharing breakfast with her father or reading on the back porch, infused with meaning again. David, burdened by guilt for having trusted Linda and failed to see his daughter suffering, took the first steps toward healing. He sat with Emma each evening, sometimes speaking, sometimes just sharing silence. Gradually, he apologized in words and actions, listening more closely, inviting Emma's opinions on matters once dictated, and above all, assuring her that she was believed and cherished. The chasm carved by loss and misjudgment slowly narrowed as they both worked to rebuild trust. Liberation, though, was not only the absence of Linda, it was the rediscovery of belonging. Friends who had pulled away during the months of chaos began to reappear. Megan, her steadfast confidant, came over most afternoons with baked goods and a pack of silly jokes, determined to make Emma smile. Some classmates, once swayed by Linda's whispers, reached out with awkward apologies or tentative invitations. Emma didn't trust easily. Her scars were still fresh. But with each kind gesture, the ghost of being alone lost its hold. Legal matters continued their course. Investigations corroborated what Emma and her allies had disclosed. Financial manipulation, forged records, and calculated emotional abuse. Linda's attempts to defend herself only deepened scrutiny. Eventually, the courts placed restraining orders for Emma and her father's protection and began proceedings to reclaim misappropriated funds. For Emma, the legal resolution was less about vengeance than clarity. There was comfort in knowing her story was officially recognized, her suffering not ignored or dismissed. Yet justice was not only meted out in legal documents and courtrooms. The true liberation came in everyday victories that had once felt impossible. Choosing what to eat without fear of criticism, playing Emma's favorite music at breakfast, sprawling in the living room to watch movies with her father on a lazy Sunday. Mrs. Martin, the housekeeper who had quietly stood by Emma's side, now became a cherished friend. Her cheerful presence, a steady reassurance that kindness could persist even in dark times. With Linda gone, David and Emma turned to healing. They began seeing a family counselor, first at Emma's request, then as a joint commitment. Conversations once avoided were brought into the open, about Emma's mother, about grief, about mistakes made on both sides. Sometimes the pain was raw, the regret heavy, but slowly, honesty replaced the quiet shame. Emma learned that forgiveness was not a sudden epiphany, but a process, one that freed her to move forward without forgetting what she had endured. Emma also started journaling again, but this time, less out of desperation and more for self-discovery. She filled pages with lists of dreams, sketches of what happiness could look like, reflections on courage and vulnerability. What had begun as a means to document injustice now became a tool for rebuilding herself. She wrote thank you notes to Megan, to Mrs. Martin, even to the school counselor who eventually rallied to her defense. Sometimes she wrote unsent letters to her mother, confiding fears and small triumphs she wished she could share. School changed too. Emma's reputation, once tarnished by Linda's calculated gossip, gradually recovered as the truth became clear. Teachers who'd doubted her quietly reassessed old judgments. Ms. Rourke, the homeroom teacher, offered sincere apologies and extra support. From the experience, Emma emerged quieter but steadier, with a hard-won confidence. She realized she could stand firm even when authority doubted her, and that voicing truth, though frightening, was worth the risk. In the community, the Sanders story became a quiet example of resilience and justice done. Neighbors who'd looked the other way during Emma's ordeal now offered support, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with humble acknowledgement of past mistakes. David, who had always shied away from attention, made it clear that Emma's perseverance was the reason their family had survived, her courage lighting a path not only for them, but others too. One Saturday in late spring, Emma noticed wildflowers blooming along the path behind their yard, bright blue bonnets and yellow primroses pushing through the tough Texas soil. She realized that, like those wildflowers, she and her father were learning to thrive after hardship. There would be setbacks, old wounds sometimes ached, and the fear of being doubted lingered. But now, each day carried promise, where once it only brought dread. Justice and liberation did not mean erasing the past. It meant reclaiming her future. Little by little, Emma rebuilt her inner world, no longer shaped by Linda's lies, but by hope, honesty, and the quiet assurance of her own worth. For the first time since her mother's death, Emma allowed herself to make plans, joining a summer art program, volunteering with a local support group for teens, and even drafting the outline of a story inspired by her own experiences. She understood, at last, that survival was more than endurance. It was the courage to seek joy again, to risk believing in kindness, and to help others along the way. Every scar was proof that darkness could be overcome, and every small act of freedom marked another step toward the life she deserved. As twilight painted gold streaks across the Texas sky, Emma sat beside her father on the porch and watched the world settle into peace. Justice had done more than remove a villain from their lives. It had returned their family to itself, stronger and softer than before. Emma looked ahead, trusting that whatever came next, she could face it with open eyes, an honest heart, and the unbreakable knowledge that she was, at last, truly free. Acceptance and forgiveness. The storm had passed, but the calm that followed was different from anything Emma had expected. No longer was her life dictated by fear or tension, but stability did not instantly erase the damage done. As the weeks unfurled into summer, acceptance and forgiveness became daily choices, sometimes hard-won, sometimes unexpectedly gentle. For both Emma and her father, the transition to a new normal was complicated by guilt, regret, and a quiet longing for what might have been had Linda never entered their lives. In the earliest days, the house felt emptied, relieved of poisonous control, yet echoing with memories both good and bad. Emma often paused on the stairs, expecting to hear Linda's voice calling her back to complete some chore or to be met with a critical glance. The absence was both a relief and a challenge. These small ghosts were stubborn, demanding to be noticed and released in their own time. Emma's father, David, seemed haunted the most. He became more attentive, perhaps in ways he wished he'd always been. They cooked breakfast together in comfortable silence, took late evening walks around the block, and sometimes sat up at night talking about everyday things. One humid evening, as lightning bugs danced in the backyard, David finally spoke the words that had sat between them for so long. "I'm sorry, Em," he said, his voice thick, "for not seeing what you were going through, for letting things get so far." Emma listened quietly, feeling both the ache of his admission and a swell of compassion. Forgiveness, she realized, was not a single act, but a process, a gradual letting go not only for others, but for herself. In therapy, father and daughter explored wounds new and old. Their counselor encouraged them not to rush. True healing couldn't be forced. Emma learned to voice the anger she had buried for so long, sometimes directed at her father, sometimes at herself for not speaking up sooner. Over time, those sessions became safer places to grieve her mother again, to acknowledge the unfairness of all she had lost. A turning point came as Emma began to understand her own capacity for empathy. One evening, she reread her old journals, tracing her journey from despair to resistance to hope. She noticed how her writing about Linda had shifted, from all-consuming rage to something more detached. Linda had been destructive, yes, but she was also small and trapped in her own bitterness. Emma wondered what damage had been wrought before Linda even entered their lives. What cycle of insecurity or pain might have shaped her? This wasn't to excuse Linda's actions or absolve her from the harm done, but it allowed Emma to put down some of the burden she'd carried. Forgiveness isn't saying what happened was okay, her counselor had told her. It's choosing not to let it be the only story you carry forward. Emma took that advice to heart. She found herself less consumed by the past as she poured her energy into art and friendship. She and Megan organized a small gathering at a local park, an afternoon picnic with classmates, old and new. Apprehensive at first, Emma soon found laughter coming more easily. She accepted apologies from peers with a simple nod, not requiring them to fix what had happened. Just acknowledge it. At home, she resurrected scrapbooking projects she'd started with her mother, reassembling family photos, adding bits of poetry and favorite quotes. Sometimes she would cry while doing it, not from pain, but gratitude for the good times. These small rituals anchored her in the present, creating space for what lay ahead. Their relationship with Mrs. Martin deepened too. The housekeeper became like family, stopping by with homemade bread or offering gardening tips. When Emma confided that she sometimes dreamt of her mother or felt a sudden pang of missing her, Mrs. Martin would remind her, gently, "Healing is never a straight line, honey. Some days are harder, but you're moving forward." David worked to rebuild trust not just with Emma, but with himself. He volunteered at the local library, joined a support group for parents who had survived emotionally abusive relationships, and even tried his hand at writing essays about his experience. "If telling our story can help just one person," he told Emma, "then maybe we can make something good out of all this." Gradually, the community's perception shifted. Neighbors, once distant or complicit in their silence, became more engaged, sending cards, offering invitations to neighborhood block parties, or simply stopping to say hello. Emma found a peace in these ordinary interactions, a reaffirmation that the world could be kind, even if it had failed her once. Forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, was a battle Emma faced quietly. She forgave herself for chapters when she'd withdrawn, for nights spent wishing for escape instead of fighting, for believing Linda's words even as she knew they couldn't be true. Her journal filled now with declarations of worth, reminders that strength takes many forms, that surviving is itself heroic. The final test came unexpectedly. Weeks after Linda's last court hearing, a single letter arrived in the mail, a formal apology composed at her attorney's urging. The wording was stilted, impersonal, but attached was a brief handwritten note. "Whatever my reasons, I hurt you. I hope you will have a better life than I knew how to give." Emma read the letter twice. She tucked it in a drawer, not out of resentment, but as a marker of something finished. She would not let anger define her future, nor would she hold on to pity. Acceptance, she realized, was not a gift she could offer Linda. It was a gift to herself. By late summer, Emma felt lighter, her laughter fuller, her gaze clearer. She no longer feared the quiet, nor searched the shadows for threats. She rediscovered joy in cycling down familiar streets, exploring the local farmer's market with Megan, or sharing vanilla ice cream on a sweltering afternoon. In small but meaningful ways, Emma and David laid foundations for new traditions. They started Pizza Fridays, where each took turns choosing movie favorites, sometimes old classics Emma's mother loved, sometimes silly recent releases. With each slice, they celebrated not the absence of hardship, but the presence of perseverance and the growth that comes from surviving. Emma's journey toward acceptance was far from linear, but as she stood beneath the big Texas sky, open, cloudless, stretching endlessly into the future, she understood forgiveness as an act of ongoing courage. It was the willingness to love herself wholly, history and all. Every sunrise offered a chance to begin again, and Emma, at last, stepped forward not as a survivor alone, but as someone ready to embrace the fullness of life ahead. Light of the future. As one chapter of Emma's life drew to a close, another opened, filled not with shadows, but with possibility. The pain and turmoil she had endured no longer defined her. Instead, they became the bedrock on which a new sense of self was built, resilient, open-hearted, and quietly bold. The sun seemed brighter that spring, the Texas sky vaster. Every familiar corner of the world now shimmered with hope. With Linda's departure long behind her, Emma found herself seeking purpose beyond personal healing. It started as a gentle curiosity, a need to understand how others survived their own storms. Reading memoirs of teens overcoming adversity, she realized her story was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a larger tapestry of resilience and renewal. This realization filled her with determination. What if her experiences could somehow help others? What if her scars could transform into beacons for those still searching in the dark? Emma dove into action. She began volunteering at a local support center for children affected by abuse and family turmoil. On her first day, she felt the knot of old anxiety tense in her stomach. Memories never vanish entirely. But she pressed on, greeted by the director with a smile that radiated warmth. The work was sometimes hard. She listened to stories of children learning to trust again, and at times, their sadness mirrored her own. Yet for each tear, there were also moments of quiet triumph. A shy child breaking into laughter, a painting filled with bold colors, a circle of young people learning that vulnerability could be safe. Gradually, Emma gained confidence as a mentor, sharing her journey with small groups. She didn't dramatize her story, nor did she minimize it. Instead, she offered honesty, the confusion, the fear, the relief that came with being believed. As she spoke, she found young faces watching with wide, attentive eyes. "The hardest part isn't always what happens to you," she told them one bright afternoon. "It's convincing yourself that you deserve to be heard, even when no one else is listening." Afterward, one girl, arms folded tightly across her chest, quietly slipped Emma a thank you note. Back at home, life unfolded along gentle, hopeful lines. Emma's relationship with her father transformed, evolving into a partnership built on mutual respect, humor, and forgiveness. They planned a summer trip to the hill country, a simple getaway, filled with stargazing, river swims, and long talks about the past and future alike. For the first time in years, the word family made Emma smile rather than ache. More quietly, Emma rekindled old friendships and carefully explored new ones. She and Megan partnered with teachers to launch a student wellness club at school. Their goal was modest but profound, to create a space where stories could be shared without fear of judgment. The group began in the art room after school, just a handful of students and a box of cookies, but soon it grew. students painting, writing, or simply talking in low voices as music played in the background. Emma learned that leadership didn't always mean speaking the loudest. Often, it meant listening hardest. Academically, Emma rediscovered her curiosity. Courses in psychology and creative writing fascinated her. She wrote essays about navigating grief and rebuilding trust, and her English teacher encouraged her to submit one to a state competition. To her own amazement, her story healing, Emma discovered, had rhythms of its own. She still had nights of restlessness or days when a passing scent or song triggered old wounds. But those moments no longer trapped her. Instead, she learned to honor them, pausing, breathing, letting the melancholy pass through like a summer storm. Family counseling continued, but its tone shifted. Now, it was less about mending, more about celebrating growth. One gentle evening, Emma and David sat on their back porch, fireflies blinking around the yard. David looked over and said, "I can't say I'll never make mistakes again, but I do promise to never stop learning. From you, from the past, from what's ahead." Emma squeezed his hand in reply, grateful for a love that chose humility and persistence over pride. As the months passed, Emma formed goals for the future. She researched colleges with strong social work and psychology programs, imagining herself one day guiding other teens out of pain's shadow. She applied to be a summer camp counselor, her essay centering not on leadership in a traditional sense, but in kindness, empathy, and knowing how to listen. She shadowed Mrs. Martin in the kitchen, learning family recipes and the secret of her famous cornbread. Joy found in small acts of care. But Emma also understood the importance of living in the present. She took long walks in fields blossoming with bluebonnets, spent lazy afternoons sketching the world as she saw it, and filled her room with photographs old and new. She kept a gratitude jar on her dresser, each slip of paper a testament to small victories. Told my truth today, laughed until I couldn't breathe, didn't flinch when the phone rang. One spring, Emma gave a speech at the community center's annual gala. Surrounded by neighbors, teachers, and families, she recounted her journey not as a tale of tragedy, but as proof of the light that can emerge from darkness. "I believe," she told them, "that every step I've taken in healing makes it easier for the next girl to do the same. No one heals alone. We learn from each other how to trust again, how to hope again, how to shine again." Applause swept through the hall, but Emma's pride wasn't in the recognition. It was in the quiet understanding that her scars no longer demanded to be hidden. She had become, in her own gentle way, a source of hope. Looking forward, Emma felt grounded and expectant. She couldn't predict every challenge ahead, but she trusted herself to face them with empathy and courage, the very traits hardship had honed. She faced her future not as someone fleeing her past, but as someone who had mined strength from it. On the anniversary of her mother's passing, she and David planted a small grove of wildflowers beside the house, standing together in the warm wind. Emma felt something profound settle inside, a sense of peace, of continuity, and of unwritten chapters filled with possibility. She whispered, "Thank you for the light, Mom," knowing her mother's memory would forever guide her. As dusk deepened, Emma wrote in her journal for the last time that school year. She listed dreams yet to be chased, changes yet to be made, ways to serve and to savor the world around her. Hope was no longer a fragile flame. It was the sunrise on the horizon, steady and dazzling, illuminating a future entirely her own.